It was 2 a.m., and my clinic was supposed to be closed. I was just a former surgical resident who got kicked out of the program for stealing medical supplies to treat people who couldn't afford a hospital bill. Now I ran a cash-only, no questions asked, modern basement clinic with basic equipment in it, which is easily located. Mostly, I stitched up bar fights or treated kids with bad fevers, just normal illness. For years, I haven't performed a surgery. That was my one hard rule. I put all of that behind me. Until tonight. My entire heavy doorframe ripped out of the drywall with a massive crash while I was resting my head on my office desk. Before I could even reach for the silent panic button under my desk, 3 huge guys in ruined, soaking wetsuits shoved their way inside. They were helping a 4th man with injury. "Yes, clear the table," the biggest one yelled. He had a nasty cut over his eye, but the gun in his hand was perfectly steady. He pointed the barrel right at my chest. "Do it now or I put a hole through you." My hands shook so badly I could barely push the rolling tray of bandages out of the way. They hauled the guy onto my stainless steel exam table. He was huge, heavy, and leaving a thick trail of dark red blood all over my clean floor. I stepped closer, my slip-resistant footwear squeaking in the mess. The man on the table wasn't just some street thug. Even half-conscious and bleeding out, he carried this heavy, terrifying weight. He wore a custom black dress shirt, totally soaked through on the left side. His skin was pale, covered in dark, sprawling tattoos that peeked out from his collar. He took one in the side, the guy with the gun said, stepping right up into my space. "You're going to get the bullets out. You're going to close him up. If his heart stops, yours does too." I swallowed hard. My throat felt like dry sandpaper. I grabbed a pair of heavy trauma shears and cut the boss's shirt open. The damage was bad. Really bad. The bullet in his side had missed his lung by a fraction of an inch, but he was losing volume fast. I didn't have a full surgical team, an anesthesiologist, or a blood bank. I just had a rusty desk lamp, a local aesthetic, and a box of tools. "I need pressure here," I ordered, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. I forced the gunman's hand down onto the worst wound. "Hold it hard, don't let up." For the next hour, the rest of the world disappeared. It was just me, at the harsh glare of my overhead light, and the terrifying sound of his ragged breathing. I dug the slugs out with forceps. My gloves were completely coated in his blood. Every time the boss groaned or flinched, the 2 guys guarding the door raised their weapons. It was a nightmare. Finally, I pulled the bullet from his side. It clattered heavily into my metal kidney dish. I stitched him up as fast as my hands would move. Layering the bandages tightly, I stepped back, pulling my mask down. I was sweating right through my scrubs. "He's stable," I breathed out, leaning against the counter. "But he needs a real hospital. I don't have the IV fluids to replace what he lost." The gunman sneered, lowering his weapon just an inch. "He doesn't do hospitals." Before I could argue, a violent crash echoed from the alleyway outside. A glass shattered in my waiting room. Someone shouted, followed by the deafening crack of a shotgun. The clinic was under attack. The guys in the room panicked. The one holding the gun grabbed me by the arm, throwing me hard behind the metal exam table. "They tracked us, get him up!" But the boss was already moving. I watched in absolute shock as the man I just stitched up swung his legs off the table. He was gritting his teeth, a muscle ticking in his jaw, but his dark eyes were completely alert. He didn't look like a guy who just lost 2 pints of blood. He looked like a guy who was about to kill everyone in the building. He reached over, grabbing a heavy pistol from his guy's waistband. Then, his dark, calculating eyes locked onto me, hiding on the floor. He didn't say a word. He just reached down, his massive, a blood-stained hand wrapping around my wrist like an iron vice. "Wait, what are you doing?" I panicked, trying to pull my arm back. "I fixed you, let me go." "They know you saved me." His voice was a deep, rough gravel, barely above a whisper over the sound of gunfire outside. He pulled me up to my feet, his grip completely unbreakable. "Which means they're going to kill you too, and another reason I am not done healing. Run." He didn't give me a chance to argue. His grip on my wrist was brutal, pulling me so hard my slip-resistant shoes skidded across the bloody linoleum. Gunfire erupted from the front of the clinic, deafening pops that rattled my teeth. Wood splintered, and the cheap drywall of my waiting room started tearing apart. "Behind the building," the biggest enforcer roared, firing wildly down the narrow hallway to cover us. out, the boss shoved me toward the heavy steel fire door in the supply room. I hit the crash bar with both hands, stumbling out into the freezing, pouring rain. The sudden cold hit me like a physical punch. It was pitch black in the alley, smelling like wet garbage and metallic ozone. I tripped over a discarded pallet, my knees scraping the wet asphalt, but he didn't let me fall. He hauled me right back up by the collar of my scrubs. For a guy who just had a slug dug out of his abdomen, he moved like a freight train. Adrenaline was the only thing keeping him vertical, and as a doctor, I knew that crash was going to be ugly when it finally hit. "Keep moving, huh?" He grunted, his breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. His free hand was pressed tightly against the fresh bandages I had just applied under his ruined black shirt. A sleek, heavily black minibus tore around the corner of the alley, its tires screeching against the wet pavement. It didn't even come to a full stop before the back door flew open. The boss practically threw me inside. I crashed onto the dark leather seats, scrambling backward as he climbed in right behind me. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off the deafening sound of the rain and the shootout. The driver hit the gas, throwing us both against the upholstery as the bus peeled out into the dark city streets. I pushed my wet hair out of my eyes, my chest heaving. The reality of what just happened hit me all at once. My clinic was destroyed. I was in the back of a bulletproof bus with a mob boss, and I was covered in his blood. "You can't just take me," I gasped, my voice shaking uncontrollably. I pressed my back hard against the opposite door, looking for a lock. There wasn't one. "I saved your life. I did what your men asked. Let me out at the next corner." He didn't answer right away. The adrenaline was finally wearing off. He slumped back against the dark leather, his head rolling to the side. The pale streetlights flashing through the tinted windows illuminated the sheer exhaustion on his face. He was sweating heavily, his breathing turning ragged again. He slowly turned his head to look at me. His dark eyes were hooded but dangerously sharp. "The men who shot me just saw a doctor walk out the back door with their target," he said, his voice a low, strained rasp. "If I drop you on a corner, they will pick you up within the hour. They will torture you to find out where I went. And then they will put a bullet in your head." I stopped searching for the door handle. My stomach dropped straight to the floorboards. "You're in this now," he muttered, his eyes closing as a wince of raw pain crossed his face. His massive hand tightened around the leather armrest. "And like I said, I'm not done healing." Immediately he said that he collapsed. I told the men inside the bus that their boss needs urgent attention and all my medical materials are in the clinic. We need to get some in any nearby pharmacy or clinic. He slumped forward, his dead weight pinning my leg to the seat. The bus swerved hard as the driver took a sharp corner, throwing the boss's head against my shoulder. "Hey!" the guy in the passenger seat yelled, twisting around and aiming his gun right at my face. "Aw, what did you do to him?" "I didn't do anything," I shouted over the roar of the engine, pushing the boss's heavy shoulders back against the leather. I pressed 2 fingers hard against his neck. His pulse was there, but it was weak and racing way too fast. "He's going into hypovolemic shock. He lost too much blood before you even got him to my table," the guy up front cursed, slamming his fist against the dashboard. "Wake him up." "I can't just wake him up," I fired back, my medical training completely overriding my fear of the gun pointed at me. I left all my IV bags, my plasma pushers, and my antibiotics back at the clinic. "If you don't get me fluids right now, your boss is leaving this bus in a body bag." The driver looked at the guy in the passenger seat through the rearview mirror. "Marco, what do we do?" "That we can't take him to a hospital. The feds have eyes everywhere." "Find a pharmacy," Marco ordered, his voice tight with panic. "A 24-hour one, just drive." I kept my hands pressed hard against the bandages on the boss's side, feeling the warm stickiness seeping through my fingers again. Every bump in the road made me flinch. 5 long minutes later, the bus slammed on its brakes, tires skidding on the wet asphalt. We were parked crookedly in front of a brightly lit 24-hour chain pharmacy on the edge of the industrial district. It looked mostly empty, save for a tired cashier behind the front counter reading a magazine. "You," Marco barked, pointing the barrel of his gun at me. "You're coming with me. Get exactly what you need to keep him breathing. No funny business. Let go or I'll shoot the cashier first and you second." He grabbed the back of my scrubs and shoved me out into the pouring rain. We burst through the sliding glass doors. The bell chimed happily, A ridiculous sound considering Marco immediately pulled his weapon and pointed it at the terrified teenager behind the register. "Get on the floor and put your hands on your head," Marco screamed. The kid dropped like a rock, crying out in panic. "Move!" Marco shoved me down the fluorescent-lit aisles. "5 minutes, Doc, go!" My hands were shaking so badly, I knocked an entire shelf of vitamins onto the floor, but I forced my brain to focus. This wasn't a hospital. I had to improvise. I grabbed a plastic shopping basket and sprinted toward the medical supply aisle. I threw in bottles of rubbing alcohol, heavy rolls of gauze, and surgical tape. I ran to the back counter, hopping the short pharmacy gate. The pharmacist wasn't there, which was a blessing. I ripped open the cabinets, tossing boxes of sterile syringes, saline solution, and heavy-duty, broad-spectrum antibiotics into my basket. It wasn't blood, but a heavy saline push would keep his blood pressure from totally collapsing until we reached somewhere safe. "Time's up," Marco yelled from the front of the store, his head on a swivel, watching the dark parking lot through the glass. "We got to go!" I grabbed a handful of medical tubing and scrambled back over the counter. We bolted out of the store, leaving the terrified cashier still shaking on the floor. Marco shoved me back into the dark, freezing minibus. The boss hadn't moved. He was deathly pale. "Drive," Marco yelled, slamming the door. I fell to my knees on the floorboards of the bus, tearing open the plastic packaging with my teeth. The bus hit a pothole, tossing me sideways, but I ignored it. I found a vein in the boss's thick, tattooed arm, tied a piece of rubber tubing tightly around his bicep, and slipped the needle in. I held the saline bag up high, squeezing it to force the fluids into his system faster. I sat there in the dark, covered in blood, watching the steady drip of the IV, while the city blurred past the tinted windows. He took a long, ragged breath, his chest rising slowly. He wasn't dead yet. But as the bus merged onto the highway, heading completely out of the city limits, I realized my nightmare was just starting. The highway lights disappeared hours ago. We were deep in the woods, bouncing violently over a rutted dirt road. And every time the bus hit a ditch, I had to brace my shoulder against the leather seat to keep the IV needle from ripping out of the boss's arm. My knees were bruised and entirely numb from kneeling on the hard floorboards. I was holding the plastic saline bag up with a cramping hand, my scrubs sticking to my skin with dried blood and cold sweat. "Open the gate," Marco yelled from the front. Through the rain-streaked window, I saw high chain-link fences topped with rusted barbed wire. We weren't at some luxurious mafia estate. We were pulling into a massive, run-down auto salvage yard. Mountains of crushed cars loomed in the dark like giant metal skeletons. The bus drove straight into a huge corrugated steel garage, and the heavy metal doors rattled shut behind us, cutting off the sound of the storm. "Get him out," Marco barked, jumping down before the bus even stopped rolling completely. The driver threw the back doors open. Freezing air and the sharp smell of old motor oil flooded the cabin. They grabbed the boss by the shoulders and under the knees, hauling his heavy weight out. "Watch his side," I yelled, scrambling after them, holding the IV bag high to keep the line taut. "If you tear those stitches, he bleeds out right here." They dragged him toward a greasy metal workbench in the center of the garage. A couple of other guys holding shotguns emerged from the shadows, looking completely panicked at the sight of their bleeding boss. "Clear that off," I ordered. I didn't even think about the fact that I was yelling at armed criminals. I just saw a patient. One of the guards swept his arm across the metal table, sending heavy wrenches, spark plugs, and dirty rags clattering to the floor. Marco and the driver lowered the boss onto the hard steel. I hooked the saline bag onto a rusted overhead light fixture. I dug into my plastic pharmacy basket, ripping open an alcohol pad to wipe down the area around his IV. His breathing was shallow, but his skin didn't look quite as gray as it had back in the city. The fluids had kept his blood pressure from totally crashing. Suddenly, his massive hand shot up and grabbed my wrist. I gasped, stumbling back a step. The boss's dark eyes blinked open. He was staring up at the harsh, flickering fluorescent shop lights before his gaze locked onto me. His face was covered in a cold sweat. I could see the raw pain tightening the muscles in his jaw, but he didn't make a single sound. "You're in a garage, I said quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs. "We're outside the city. You lost a lot of blood, but the saline is working. You need to stay totally still." He didn't let go of my wrist. His grip wasn't violent this time, but it was heavy and firm, an anchor. "Marco," the boss grunted. His voice was a dry, heavy scrape that echoed in the quiet garage. Marco immediately stepped up to the table. "I'm right here, boss. We lost them. The perimeter is secure." The boss didn't look at Marco. He kept his eyes entirely on me, studying the exhaustion and fear on my face. The boss ordered, his breathing ragged. "She gets whatever she needs. If she tells you to do something, you do it." Marco swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, boss." The boss finally released my wrist. His head fell back against the hard metal table, his eyes sliding shut again. "Won't keep me breathing, Doc," he muttered into the quiet room. "Because I need to be on my feet. This war is not over." The fluorescent lights buzzed. It was a miserable, constant sound. My back ached from sitting on an overturned plastic milk crate for what felt like 6 hours. The garage was freezing, holding on to the damp chill of the rain outside. I wrapped my arms tightly around my chest, watching the last few drops of saline empty from the IV bag. The boss was quiet. His chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. The bleeding had stopped, and the heavy gauze pad taped to his side was mostly dry. I had done my job. I stood up, my knees popping loudly in the quiet space. I looked toward the front of the garage. Marco was sitting on a stack of bald tires by the steel door, a shotgun resting across his lap. His chin was resting on his chest. He was asleep. I looked at the heavy steel side door just a few feet away from me. It was secured with a thick chain, but the padlock wasn't fully clicked shut. I could probably slip the chain out. I could run out into the woods and disappear before the sun came up. "Don't." The voice was raspy and quiet, but it stopped me dead in my tracks. I turned around. The boss was awake. His dark eyes tracked my movement in the dim light. He pushed himself up and on his good elbow, his face twisting as the muscles in his abdomen pulled tight against my stitches. "Lie back down," I told him, dropping my hands from my chest and stepping quickly back to the metal workbench. "You're going to rip the sutures. I don't have enough thread to close you up twice. If you run out that door, my men will shoot you," he said. Yet he completely ignored my medical advice and swung his heavy legs over the edge of the workbench. "And if Marco sleeps through it, the cartel that hit my safe house will find you on the road. Look at yourself." I looked down. He was right. My faded blue scrubs were stiff and dark with his dried blood. I looked like a walking crime scene. Nobody was going to give me a ride. "Who are they?" I asked, my voice finally cracking a little under the exhaustion. "Why did they shoot you?" He reached out, grabbing a relatively clean shop towel from a tool cart to wipe the cold sweat off his forehead. "Rivals. They found out my security detail was light tonight. Someone on my payroll gave them my location." He looked around the dirty garage, his jaw tightening with disgust. "This isn't a real safe house. It's a junkyard." My men panicked. "Now, we can't stay here in the daylight." "You can't move," I argued. I pointed at the empty plastic bag hanging from the light fixture. "Your blood volume is too low. You need a transfusion and bed rest, not a road trip." "I need a burner phone," he countered, sliding off the metal table. His heavy boots hit the concrete floor with a thud. For a second, he stood perfectly straight. Then he swayed violently. I instinctively lunged forward, grabbing his bare bicep with both hands to keep him from hitting the floor. He was heavy, his muscles rock hard under my grip, but his skin was burning hot. "Fever." "You're burning up," I said, real panic flaring in my chest again. The bullet might have dragged fabric into the wound, or the tools I used weren't sterile enough. You need heavy, hospital-grade antibiotics. If you go septic out here in a garage, you will die, and I can't stop it. He looked down at my hands gripping his arm. Then he looked up at my face. He didn't pull away. "Pack your pharmacy bag, Doc," he grunted, his breathing heavy as he finally stepped out of my hold. He walked stiffly toward the sleeping guard, kicking Marco's boot to wake him up. "We're going to pay a visit to an old friend of mine. He owes me his life, and he has a very clean basement. You all need a proper bath and a proper meal." Marco jolted awake, the heavy shotgun nearly slipping off his lap and clattering to the concrete floor. He blinked wildly, staring at the boss standing over him. "Get the bus started," the boss rasped, leaning heavily against a stack of tires. He looked like absolute death. The fever was stripping the color right out of his face. Marco scrambled to his feet. "Boss, you shouldn't be walking." "I said start the engine," he snapped, his voice rough and completely out of patience. I didn't wait around to be told what to do. I grabbed the plastic pharmacy basket and started throwing my leftover supplies into it. Half-empty rolls of gauze, surgical tape, and the remaining bottles of alcohol. I climbed into the back of the dark minibus, sliding the basket under the leather seat. A minute later, Marco and the driver practically carried the boss into the back. They laid him across the long bench seat. The heavy garage doors rattled open, and the driver hit the gas. We bumped out of the junkyard and back onto the muddy dirt road. It was dawn now. A miserable, flat gray light filtered through the tinted windows. The rain had finally stopped. But the tension inside the truck was suffocating. Driving a bullet-riddled bus in the daylight was a massive risk, but staying in that freezing garage was a guaranteed death sentence. The boss started shivering. I crawled across the floorboards, bracing myself against the leather seats as the bus swerved around a pothole. Chills were a terrible sign. It meant his core temperature was spiking fast. The infection was already in his bloodstream. I dug through my plastic basket, my hands shaking. I had grabbed some basic amoxicillin from the pharmacy, but it wasn't nearly strong enough to fight off a deep tissue infection from a dirty bullet. I popped 2 extra-strength Tylenol out of a blister pack. It was a pathetic band-aid for what was happening to his body, but it was all I had. "Open your mouth," I ordered, and he cracked one dark eye open, glaring at me. But he parted his lips. I tossed the pills in. "Chew them," I told him, handing him a half-empty water bottle Marco had left in the cup holder. "It'll hit your system faster. It's going to taste incredibly bitter, but I don't care. Swallow it." He didn't complain. He crushed the pills between his teeth, wincing at the chemical taste, and washed it down with a heavy swallow of water. He let his head fall back against the window. The glass instantly started fogging up from the heat radiating off his skin. "Who is this friend?" I asked quietly, keeping my voice under the rumble of the tires. I needed to know what kind of nightmare I was walking into next. "A guy who owes me," the boss muttered, his breath hitching as the truck hit another bump. "Yay, he runs a high-end veterinary clinic out in the suburbs. Off the books. He has sterile surgical suites, clean tools, anesthesia. A vet clinic." I almost laughed, but my chest was too tight with panic. Operating on a Mafia Boss on a stainless steel table. It fit the absolute chaos of the last 8 hours perfectly. The boss slowly turned his head toward me. His dark eyes were glassy from the fever, but the sharp, calculating intelligence was still there. He lowered his voice so the guys up front couldn't hear. "If your men didn't betray you," I asked quietly, keeping my voice under the rumble of the tires, "how did that cartel find the clinic?" "A tracker," the boss muttered, his breath hitching as the truck hit another bump. "They managed to slap a GPS magnet under the wheel of my first car we brought to your clinic, months before the first shootout. My crew is airtight. Marco would take a bullet for me. He practically grew up in my house." I looked toward the front of the bus. Marco was still scanning the tree line, hyper-focused. It was jarring to realize these violent men actually cared about each other. "Listen to me, Doc," he whispered, his chest heaving with the effort. "If I pass out before we get there, Marco makes the calls. He's my right hand. I trust him with my life." He reached out, his burning fingers wrapping loosely around my wrist. "But Marco doesn't know medicine," the boss continued, his grip tightening just a fraction. "If you need something to keep me breathing, you tell him. He will you all you need. You work with him. Understand?" "No hospital," I stared at his flushed face. He wasn't threatening me, yet he was pleading with me to save his life, and trusting me to work with his best friend to do it. "I understand," I whispered back, my heart pounding in my throat. "Just hold on." The minibus jerked to a stop. I grabbed the edge of the leather seat to keep from falling forward. Marco killed the engine. "We're here. Nobody makes a sound." I looked out the tinted window. We were parked in an alleyway behind a sleek, modern brick building in a quiet suburban office park. A discreet sign near the back door read, "World for the Pets." Marco hopped out and banged on the heavy metal security door. 3 sharp knocks, a pause, then 2 more. The locks clicked. A guy in his late 50s wearing crisp green scrubs opened the door. He took one look at Marco's shotgun and the blood soaking the front of his shirt, and all the color drained from his face. "Julian," Marco said, pushing past him into the hallway, "we need your largest surgical suite, now." Julian didn't argue. He just backed up, his hands raised in a panic. Bring him in. The back room is prepped for a Great Dane surgery this morning. It's sterile. The driver and Marco hauled the boss out of the bus. He was completely dead weight now. His head lolled heavily against Marco's shoulder. The fever had finally knocked him out. I scrambled out behind them, clutching my cheap plastic basket of supplies. The inside of the clinic smelled intensely of bleach and animal antiseptic. It was jarringly clean and bright after spending the entire night in a filthy garage and a dark truck. Put him on the table, I ordered as we pushed through double-swinging doors into a massive, but brilliantly lit operating room. They grunted, lifting his massive frame onto a large stainless steel table. It was definitely meant for dogs, but it was flat, totally sterile, and had giant overhead surgical lights. It was the best thing I'd seen in 12 hours. I need hospital-grade IV antibiotics, I said, turning immediately to Julian. I didn't care that he was older than me or that this was his clinic. My patient was dying. Whatever you use for massive infections in large breeds. And I need real IV fluids, saline, lactated ringers, whatever you have in the fridge. Julian hesitated, his eyes darting nervously toward Marco. Marco stepped right into Julian's space, his voice a low, terrifying growl. You heard the doctor. She's in charge. You get her exactly what she wants now. Julian scrambled toward a wall of glass cabinets. He pulled out thick plastic bags of fluids and a box of glass vials. Cephalexin and broad-spectrum penicillin, he stammered, handing them to me with shaky hands. Chemical makeup is exactly for humans. It'll work, I said, tearing open a sterile syringe with my teeth. I pushed the heavy antibiotics straight into his IV line. Then I hung the new fluid bag on a silver pole next to the table, cranking the drip rate wide open. I snapped on a pair of fresh blue latex gloves from a box on the counter. I looked down at the boss. His chest was barely moving. His skin was burning hot through the ruined black fabric of his shirt. Marco, I said, not looking away from the table. I need you to cut the rest of his shirt off. Julian, get me a sterile scrub brush, iodine, and a fresh scalpel. I have to reopen the wound and clean the infection out, or these drugs won't work fast enough. Marco didn't hesitate. He pulled a heavy folding knife from his pocket and sliced the custom shirt right down the middle, peeling the bloody fabric away from his boss's chest. I took a deep breath, reaching up to pull the bright surgical lights down so they focused directly on his abdomen. The mobster who had kidnapped me was lying unconscious on a dog table, entirely at my mercy. I could walk away right now. Marco was busy watching the back door. Julian was terrified. I could slip out the front entrance and disappear into the suburbs. But I looked at the dark, sprawling tattoos on his chest, remembering how he used his massive body to shield me in that alleyway. He didn't have to drag me out of my clinic. He did it because he knew I'd be killed if he left me behind. I grabbed the scalpel Julian placed on the tray next to me. All right, I muttered to myself, ignoring the tremor in my hands. Let's save the boss. The sharp smell of iodine burned my nose. I poured it directly over his abdomen, washing away the dried blood and grime from the junkyard. Hold that light steady, I told Marco. Marco didn't blink. He just gripped the handle of the overhead surgical lamp and aimed it exactly where I needed it. He didn't look away from the blood, and he didn't get in my way. I took the scalpel from the metal tray. Cutting open the stitches I had just done a few hours ago felt completely wrong, but I had no choice. The skin around the wound was hot and angry red. The infection was moving fast. But I flushed the bullet track with a heavy mix of saline and the veterinary antibiotics Julian had given me. It was messy. The fluid spilled over the edges of the metal dog table, dripping onto the clean linoleum floor. Vitals? I asked, not looking up. My hands were entirely focused on clearing out the infected tissue. Julian checked the veterinary monitor we had clipped to the boss's finger. Heart rate is 130. Blood pressure is tanking, 80/50. Squeeze that fluid bag, Marco. Force it into the line, I ordered. Marco wrapped his massive hand around the plastic bag hanging from the pole, squeezing it hard to push the life-saving liquids into his boss's veins faster. It took 45 minutes of brutal, nerve-wracking work. I scraped out the damaged tissue, and I flushed the wound 3 different times until the liquid ran completely clear. Then I took a curved needle and sewed him back up, layering the closures deep into the muscle so they wouldn't tear again. I taped a thick, sterile gauze pad firmly over his side. I tied off the last suture and dropped the bloody forceps onto the metal tray. They landed with a loud clatter. I stripped my blue latex gloves off and threw them in the red biohazard bin. My hands were cramping so badly my fingers felt locked in place. "His pressure is coming up," Julian said quietly from the corner, sounding genuinely shocked. 95/60, heart rate is dropping to 100, the fever is breaking. I grabbed the edge of the stainless steel sink, letting my head hang between my shoulders. I was breathing so hard my ribs ached. Yet I turned the faucet on and splashed freezing cold water on my face, washing away the sweat. When I turned around, Marco was standing right behind me. He wasn't pointing a gun at me anymore. He had tucked it into his waistband. He was holding out a clean paper cup full of water. I took it, my hands shaking so badly, water sloshed over the rim. "You stayed," Marco said. His voice was completely flat, but his eyes were tracking my every move. "Julian left the back door unlocked when he went to the supply closet. I saw you look at it." I drank the water in one gulp. It felt like a chill going down my dry throat. "I'm a doctor. I don't leave patients to die on dog tables." Marco stared at me for a long second. Then he gave a short, hard nod. "He owes you his life. Twice in one night. I don't care what you did before today, Doc. You're family now." Before I could even process what that meant, a low groan came from the center of the room. Marco and I both spun around. The boss was shifting on the metal table. The heavy dose of antibiotics and fluids was finally fighting back the fever. He forced his dark eyes open, squinting against the harsh glare of the surgical lights. He didn't look at Marco. He didn't look at Julian hiding by the cabinets. His eyes immediately found me standing by the sink, exhausted, pale, and covered in his blood. "Told you," the boss rasped, his chest rising in a deep, finally clear breath. His lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smirk. "You're the only smart person in the room." He tried to push himself up on his elbows. I immediately stepped forward and planted both hands flat against his bare, tattooed chest, shoving him right back down onto the metal table. "Don't," I warned him, my voice sharper than I intended. "I just spent almost an hour cleaning that infection out. If you rip those deep sutures, I'm going to let you bleed." He let his head fall back against the stainless steel. A tired, dry smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Yes, Doc." Marco let out a long, shaky exhale. It was the first time the massive enforcer actually looked relieved. He walked over and handed his boss the paper cup of water I had been drinking from. "She didn't run, boss," Marco said quietly, staying close to the table. "Julian left the back door wide open. She stayed and sewed you up." The boss took a slow sip of the water. His dark eyes shifted over the rim of the cup, locking onto me. He took in the dark bags under my eyes, my messy hair, and my scrubs completely ruined with his blood. "What's your name?" he asked. His voice was still a rough gravel, but the heavy weight of the fever wasn't dragging it down anymore. "Maya," I said. I crossed my arms over my chest, suddenly feeling very cold now that the adrenaline was fading. "Maya," he repeated. He didn't say it like a threat. He just said it like he was committing it to memory. "I'm Charles. You already met Marco." "I met his gun," I corrected. Charles shot Marco a look. Marco actually rubbed the back of his neck, looking almost apologetic. "I was stressed, Doc. You were moving slow." "I was trying not to kill him," I fired back. Charles let out a short, quiet laugh, but it quickly turned into a grimace of pain. He pressed his hand against the thick gauze taped to his side. Yet he took another breath and looked up at the ceiling, his mind clearly shifting gears from survival to strategy. "Julian," Charles called out. The vet doc stepped out from the shadows near the glass cabinets. "I'm here." "We need clean clothes. For me, Charles, and Maya. Anything you have," Charles ordered. "And we need to move. If the Reyes cartel was tracking my truck, they might start shaking down underground medical suppliers by noon. I won't put that heat on your clinic." Julian nodded quickly. "I have some oversized sweatpants and clean t-shirts in the staff locker room. I'll get them." He practically ran out of the surgical suite. I watched the swinging doors close. The exhaustion was hitting me like a ton of bricks. My legs felt like lead. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked, looking down at my bloody shoes. My clinic is shot to pieces. My equipment is gone." "You can't go back there," Charles said. He wasn't yelling, but his tone left absolutely zero room for argument. The Reyes men saw a doctor walk out the back door with me. They know what you look like. If you go back to your clinic or your apartment, you will be dead before the sun goes down. My stomach dropped. I knew he was right, but hearing it out loud made it real. My life, the quiet, hidden little life I had built for myself in the Narrows, was completely over. So what happens to me, I asked. My voice shook just a little. Charles reached out. His large, warm hand wrapped around my wrist again. He pulled me a step closer to the metal table. You come with us, he said, looking me dead in the eye. You saved my life, Maya. That means you are under my protection now. I don't care what it takes. You are family now. He looked over at Marco. Call the harbor. Have them prep the old shipping container yard. It's totally off the grid. We disappear for a few days until I can stand up, and then we go to war. Marco gave a sharp nod. I'll make the call. Julian pushed back through the double doors, carrying a stack of folded gray sweatpants and black t-shirts. He handed a set to me. Change, Charles told me, his grip on my wrist finally letting go. We leave in 10 minutes. I took the clothes and walked into the small employee bathroom attached to the surgical suite. I locked the door and leaned my forehead against the cool mirror. I stared at my reflection. There was blood on my neck, blood on my clothes. I turned the faucet on and started scrubbing my hands. I was terrified. But as I washed the dried blood away, I realized something else. For the first time in years, I have found family that actually cares. I dried my face with a rough paper towel and pulled the oversized gray sweatpants and black t-shirt. The clothes smelled strongly of bleach, but they were warm and, most importantly, free of blood. I threw my ruined scrubs directly into the biohazard bin. When I walked back into the surgical suite, Marco was already helping Charles off the metal dog table. The boss gritted his teeth, a muscle ticking violently in his jaw as he took his first actual steps since the junkyard. Easy, boss, Marco muttered, taking a massive amount of his weight over his own shoulder. I'm fine, Charles lied through his teeth. He stopped walking and looked over at me. Ready, Maya? Hearing him say my name sent a strange, unexpected jolt through my chest. Threat. I grabbed my plastic basket of medical supplies and nodded. Ready. We slipped out the back door of the vet clinic into the harsh morning light. The suburban office park was dead quiet. Marco had completely ditched the bullet-riddled minibus for a dusty, nondescript blue sedan he must have called in while I was washing up. It was the perfect vehicle to disappear in. We climbed into the back. Charles leaned his head against the cool glass of the window, his breathing heavy but finally steady. The veterinary antibiotics were doing their job, fighting back the infection, but his body had been put through a meat grinder. He needed actual sleep. The drive to the harbor took 40 tense minutes. Nobody spoke. Marco kept his eyes glued to the rearview mirror, taking random turns to make sure the Reyes cartel wasn't following us. Slowly, the neat suburban streets faded into the gritty, industrial edge of the city. The smell of salt water, diesel exhaust, and rusted iron started filtering through the car vents. Marco navigated the sedan through a maze of towering shipping containers, completely bypassing the main port gates. The metal boxes were stacked 5 stories high, creating dark, narrow steel canyons that blocked out the sun. Marco pulled the car deep into a dead-end alley of containers and cut the engine. He stepped out and unlocked a heavy padlock on the side of a massive, rust-colored shipping crate. He hauled the metal door open. Get him inside, Marco said, looking around the empty yard. I got out of the car and moved to Charles's side, letting him brace his good arm against my shoulder as we walked. We stepped through the door of the container, and I completely froze. It wasn't an empty metal box. The inside was completely retrofitted. It had thick insulated walls, harsh LED strip lighting, a small generator humming quietly in the corner, and 2 military-style cots. A heavy gun safe sat bolted to the floor near the back. It was a ghost bunker. We helped Charles onto one of the cots. He let out a low, exhausted groan as his back hit the mattress. We stay completely off the grid for the next 48 hours, Charles ordered, his voice fading as the adrenaline finally left his system. He looked over at Marco. Don't contact the capos. If Reyes has a rat in my crew, I want them to think I'm dead. Let them get sloppy. Understood, Marco said. He pulled the heavy steel door shut, locking us inside from the inside. The heavy clack of the deadbolt echoed in the small space. Charles closed his eyes. Within seconds, he was asleep. I stood in the middle of the container, clutching my plastic basket. I was locked in a steel box at the edge of the ocean with 2 mobsters. But as I looked at Charles' chest rising and falling in a steady, healthy rhythm, the absolute terror of the night finally started to fade. "Take the other cot, Maya," Marco said quietly, pulling a heavy blanket out of a duffel bag and tossing it to me. He sat down in a folding chair by the door, resting his shotgun across his knees. "I've got the watch. You sleep safe." It was a ridiculous word to use right now, but looking at the thick steel walls hiding us from the rest of the city, I actually believed him. And he also said when all of this is over, I will be well paid. I actually slept. I didn't think I would, but my body just gave out. When I opened my eyes, the harsh LED strip lights had been dimmed. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the generator in the corner and the faint sound of ocean water slapping against the concrete docks outside. I sat up on the narrow cot, rubbing my eyes. My new clothes felt heavy and smelled like industrial bleach, but they were warm. Marco was standing by the heavy steel door, peering through a tiny, reinforced peephole. He glanced over at me when the cot squeaked. "You were out for 6 hours," Marco said quietly. He checked the magazine of his rifle. "I need to step outside and walk the perimeter. Stay away from the door. Don't make any noise." "Is he okay?" I asked, looking over at the other cot. "Yeah, fever hasn't come back," Marco said. He popped the heavy deadbolt, slipped out into the alley of shipping containers, and locked us in from the outside. I stood up and walked over to the second cot. Charles was awake. His dark eyes were tracking me. He looked terrible, exhausted, pale, and bruised. But the dangerous, sharp edge was fully back in his stare. "You sleep okay, Maya?" Charles asked. His voice was a low, rough scrape in the quiet container. Hearing him say my name still felt strange. It made the whole situation too real. "I've slept on worse beds," I said, keeping my distance. "In residency, I used to sleep on the floor of the supply closet." I stepped closer and picked up his wrist to check his pulse. It was strong, a little fast, but steady. I pressed the back of my hand against his forehead. Cool and dry. "As long as the infection is definitely stalling," I told him, stepping back and crossing my arms. "The antibiotics are doing the heavy lifting now. You just need to keep still." Charles watched me for a long second. He didn't look at me like I was a hostage. He looked at me like he was trying to figure a puzzle out. "You didn't have to stay at the vet clinic," Charles said. "Marco told me Julian left the door open. You could have walked." "And get shot by the Reyes cartel?" I asked, leaning against the cold steel wall. "You said it yourself. They saw my face." "You could have taken your chances," he countered. He shifted his weight on the cot, wincing slightly as his stitches pulled. "But you didn't. You sewed me up. Why?" I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking anymore. "Because I don't let people die on my table. As even people like you." Charles let out a quiet, breathy laugh. It sounded painful. "People like me. You kick down doors and drag bleeding men into basement clinics," I said flatly. "You live in bulletproof trucks and shipping containers. What else am I supposed to call you?" He didn't argue. He just stared at the metal ceiling for a moment. "My name is Charles. I run the docks, the unions, and the supply lines in this city. Reyes wants what I have. He tried to take me off the board tonight, and he failed, because of you." He turned his head to look at me again. The intensity in his eyes made my chest tight. "You aren't a prisoner, Maya," Charles said quietly. "You're under my protection. When this is over, when Reyes is dead, I will give you whatever you want. A new clinic, a new city, money, you name it." "And until then?" I asked, at my voice barely above a whisper. "Until then," Charles said, his gaze dropping to my lips for just a fraction of a second before meeting my eyes again. "You stay right here with me."